I first saw it when I was 5, peeking out of the doorless closet next to my bedroom door, staring with wide and crystalline eyes at me from a shadowy corner that had been empty before my mother flipped off the lights. It was tall and thin, and mostly featureless in the darkness, though it jerked and shivered and wheezed as it watched me beneath a skyscape of plastic glow-in-the-dark stars. The sounds it made were impossible for a human, wet and grumbling noises that sounded like a dog struggling to breathe after being hit by a car, so disgusting and visceral that I wanted to puke. I stared back the entire night, afraid to move or reach for my bedside light, blanket held under my nose as I struggled not to doze or blink. I went to school the next day, bleary-eyed and whimpering, much to the dismay of the typically understanding Mrs. Early. I can vividly remember her clinging to my arm as she tried to get me to trace out a lowercase a with a dull green crayon that was far too waxy, mumbling to herself that she would have to have a chat with my mother over my sleep habits. The next night was no different. The light switched off, it miraculously appeared in the shadows, and it glared, unblinking at me the whole night. Its eyes like ice, reflecting the light of a nightlight I had begged my mum to move from the bathroom, a pale blue that bordered on white and glimmered like polished diamond. That night I could make out its frame, too tall for the closet, too thin to be healthy, with limbs that were as long and gangly as my sock monkeys, as it leaned out precariously in the middle of our standoff, heaving and wheezing and gagging and rasping. This continued for a while, my nursery teacher and my poor mother constantly at odds about how I kept dragging into the classroom, too tired for even snack time. CPS was threatened at one point. My mum nearly ripped out her hair trying to understand why I was so terrified, and I spent a week sleeping in her bed where the monster couldn't get me. When she started getting fed up and insisted that I be a big girl, I pretended to fall asleep by her side during her nightly wind-down on a daily basis. She felt too guilty to move me, and I racked up a month of relative safety, protected by a woman who I was convinced was impervious to everything. Then she caught on. I noticed when I woke up being carried to my room, Mum mumbling in amusement under her breath about how clever I thought I was. The light to my room flipped on. I felt my fleece blanket drape over me. I heard the light flip off. When I sat up in horror, my eyes nearly bugged when I saw my resident closet beast staring at me from its typical spot, now grinning. Its teeth were a jagged mess, and, even in the dark, I could see something slithering behind its smile. And so began the standoff once more, staring contest that lasted the entire night, punctuated by school days that ended with Mrs. Early and my mother snarling at each other in barely contained rage. They only ended when my tank ran all the way down to a big, fat E, and I caved hard. One minute, me and my visitor are glaring at each other. The next I wake up, and a glowing red 2 on my bedside clock has magically transformed into a 4:39. The monster was still there, staring, jerking, wheezing. It was still smiling. But it stayed in the closet, like some barrier kept it there. I was alive. In time, the fear died, and it became a little easier to drift off, knowing that something kept it from leaving that one spot. In fact, I dare say I became a little cocky, sitting in bed after my mum would kiss me goodnight, smiling back at it and giggling at how funny it looked, juxtaposed with the Barney poster plastered on the back of my door, bright and bubbly letters I could see in the light of my nightlight screaming, "I love you," behind its head. I sang the damn song to it a couple of times to taunt it, before rolling over and passing out. It never blinked. It kept grinning. It kept seizing. It kept staring. My voice meant nothing to it. My teasing meant nothing to it. And secure in the belief that it could not get me, it meant nothing to me. At least, for a while. I was 8 when we moved, and it never went away in that time, as steadfast as any dog. It had become such a fixture that I almost thought I'd miss it when we packed up the tempo and went to live in a marginally bigger city, Mum fed up with her failed job hunt and wanting to pursue an education. I remember the night before we left. I even told the damn thing goodbye and said a few words to it that could have been construed as sentimental. That was the first time it directly reacted to me, its eyes shining as its head turned uncomfortably sideways, nearly upside down. Something perked up on its head. Ears, maybe? As though it acknowledged hearing me. As much as I could have lived with moving and letting it fade like every other childhood memory, I learned after we unpacked our things in our new, dingy apartment that I hadn't quite won the lottery just yet. Though I was absolutely relieved to see that my new room had a larger closet with actual sliding doors, my celebration was short-lived when I woke to the sound of them squealing on the tracks at some odd hour of the night. In the flickering light of my television, I watched as long and clawed fingers curled around the edges from a slowly widening crack between them. Crystalline eyes sat atop a row of jagged, bestial teeth. Something slick and slimy squirmed behind them, pulsing and twisting like organs in a fresh kill. That was when I came to a hard realization. Whatever it was could move wherever it damn well pleased, but had chosen not to for whatever goddamn reason. There's no words for the terror I felt in that moment, watching it jerk and seize in the light of a psychic solution infomercial. I stared at it the entire night, trying not to cry, whispering apologies for every time I taunted it or called it names when I was younger and dumber and cockier.
Please don't eat me.
So the pattern began again, much to my mum's frustration. The sleepless nights, the fed-up teacher, now one Miss Bingham. Frequent attempts to sneak into her room to sleep. She was less forgiving this time around, threatening punishment and blaming horror movies I hadn't watched in months, angrily pleading with me to please just admit it was a bad dream and stop acting like a little kid. She had work in the morning at 5 a.m. and had already pulled enough overtime that week to kill a draft horse. She was so tired and she was crying, so please just be a big girl. And I was a big girl after I exhausted myself one more time. It was the same old story. I was awake, and then I woke up. Hours had passed. My guest stayed locked in the closet, and it never moved save for its horrible, unnerving tics. Time passed. It never hurt me. I knew better than to give it a reason this time around, though, so I'd content myself telling it good night before huddling under my blankets and hoping it didn't hold a grudge. That wet, rasping sound became a lullaby, something I fell asleep to every night. It almost became comforting after a while, even if the idea of it existing was not the most reassuring thought. When Mum earned her degree and we dredged up enough money to move to a nice neighbourhood, I knew better from my previous experience than to get my hope up that I'd ditch my pet monster. The moment I lay eyes upon my new room for the very first time, my mum laughed that I was such a typical pre-teen when I immediately wandered to the closet and slid the door open to inspect the size. I guess she imagined I was concerned about fitting my clothes in there, but all I could think about was how this one was taller and roomier, and maybe my uninvited guest would have enough room to stand up straight for once. I made mental notes to fix the door that had been knocked off its track because it made a horrible squealing noise, and it was hard enough adjusting to the sounds it made on its own. Sure enough, my very first night in the house, glitter lamp casting all manner of crazy colours on my bare walls, I sat and watched as claws sank into the imitation wood and carefully edged the door open. Out popped that ugly head, those crystal eyes, that monstrous smile. I nodded in grim acceptance of its presence.
Like your new home?
It gurgled like it didn't even hear me.
I'm keeping my clothes in my dresser so you have more room in there.
Its head whipped violently to the side, the top of its skull cracking against the doorframe so loudly that I was surprised my mum didn't respond from down the hall. It didn't seem to notice it had even hurt itself.
You're not going away, are you?
Wheeze, heave, gag, sputter. I sighed in exasperation, pulled my blanket over my head, and went to sleep. In retrospect, I guess it sounds odd that I became so jaded to the presence of something so terrifying and bizarre. But when something becomes an everyday occurrence, you become desensitized. Crime scene investigators get used to the sight of blood, zookeepers lose their fear of predators thrice their size, doctors learn to distance themselves from the concept of death, and I just stopped caring about the monster in my closet. It was just something that was. I accepted it was now part of my life, and by the time I was in high school, I didn't even remember why I was ever scared of it. It was kind of goofy, seemingly not very bright, and it didn't do much. Until one day, it did. You know those memories you have that are like movie clips, perfectly preserved and so vivid that if you close your eyes, you practically relive the moment? I can still recall the most minor details, right down to watching the numbers on my clock shift from 2:12 to 2:13, and the creak of the old dead tree in the front lawn that tent worms had killed earlier that spring. I remember being confused as to what had woken me up, but feeling my heart beating so rapidly that I was almost convinced I would be the first 15-year-old to die of a fear-induced heart attack. I can still feel the tingling behind my eyes as tears threatened to roll, my stomach twisting into cold and angry knots that kept shifting and squirming like mating slugs. When I sat up, I looked toward my closet just to make sure that damn thing hadn't moved, half afraid it would turn out to be some kind of exceptionally patient predator. But there it stood, staring at me with those crystal eyes. Somehow, though, I could tell something was off about it. The intensity of its stare had deadened, as though it was distracted, thinking perhaps for the first time in its life as it mindlessly heaved and choked in the darkness of the closet. It took me a moment to realize what was wrong, to process the fact that it wasn't flinching and twitching, that it had fur, short, bristly fur like a boar, and every last hair on its arms was standing straight up like a porcupine's needles. There was a pang of terror at the realization that I could die. Thoughts drifting through my head that were suddenly full of regret. I never apologized to Suzanne for accidentally implying she was fat. And doubts. Had I told my mom I loved her before I went to bed? They were interrupted, though, by a loud banging sound. Loud, like somebody slamming a sledgehammer into our front door. Loud, like a bear breaking down our living room wall. The creature's head whipped to the side, its bones cracking loudly like bubble wrap, and for the first time I saw its profile. An elongated, sloped skull, like a dog. Furry lips rotted away, so every one of its teeth were visible. Its cheekbones were unusually high, and its features sunken, and a strange, hyena-like mane stood tall on the back of its neck. Ears that seemed to sprout from nowhere shot up like radar dishes atop of its head, previously flattened like the crest of a bird. It stood rigid. Those crystal eyes turned in their sockets toward me. There was a surprisingly human expression to them. It was silently screaming at me. Did you hear that? The banging came again, and I could feel a frantic scream climbing up my throat. Then I could feel something clamped around my face, something cold and coarse, and so very bony, and sharp, painful nails digging into my cheek. It was on me, leaning over me, and I could see that beneath its skin was something writhing like twisting eels. I could count its every rib through its stitched-together skin, every crack in the exposed bone of its face, every nick and tear in its massive ears. Between those jaws, behind those teeth, I finally saw what had been squirming there this whole time. A tongue, far too long for its mouth, slick and bloody with the apparent texture of uncooked liver. It swirled in its mouth, pressed against the inside of its jaws, bulged out from the gaps between its teeth. A bang, this time with a crash. I tried to squeal again, and it tightened its grip, furry brows narrowing in dissatisfaction. I prayed that my mum would miraculously hear and save me, but it was growing increasingly apparent that her noise machine was drowning all of the noise out from the opposite end of the house. I twisted my head and tried to pull away, tears streaming down my cheeks as I thought of my mother, of me, of this thing that had my head in a vice grip. Shuffling. A curse from somewhere deeper in the house. The monster from my closet heaved a rancid breath in my face before deciding to turn me loose. Slowly, it sank to the floor, a disjointed mess that practically slithered along the ground like it didn't have a bone in its body. It twisted at awkward angles as it dragged itself along, grunting and hissing as I practically kicked myself off of the bed opposite it. I watched in horror as it reached one gangly arm up and up, wrapping long fingers around the doorknob and carefully, quietly pushing it open. It normally creaked, but the creature had a magic touch. A man's voice muttered something incomprehensible from the direction of the living room, the sound of boots on hardwood breaking the silence. The sound that escaped the monster could almost have been mistaken for joy. A long and shrill squeal, like air escaping a balloon. With a surprising amount of fluidity, it rose to its feet, broken and dislocated bits fitting back together like puzzle pieces as it reassembled its body beneath its skin. One quick glance over its shoulder at me, a warning, I think, and it stepped out into the hallway as though it had never been broken at all. I couldn't make it out in the darkness of the hallway. I could hear it, though, lost in the shadows and tittering in 10 different voices, those of young and old and everywhere in between. Its lungs rattled like a dying man with its every wet, viscous breath. Then a man's voice quite clearly rang out.
What the fuck is that?
The only good look I have ever gotten of that thing was when the beam of light washed over it, a flashlight slowly snaking across the wall and floor until it came to rest on its utterly empty face. It squinted against the light, eyes glowing a cold blue. Every detail of its fur, salt and pepper like an aged pet, became obvious, from the parasites crawling through the sparse forests of hair to the streaks of blood and scars that carved through it like ravines. It stood on its toes. It flexed its fingers. It arched uncomfortably backwards and opened its mouth to free its waggling, dripping tongue. That hung flaccid, draping over menacing teeth, uncoiling down to its shoulders. Then it screamed. It was a mostly indescribable sound, like a hawk screaming as it crashed through a window while dragging its talons across steel, so loud and ear-piercing that I swore I felt blood oozing down the side of my head. Its jaws unhinged, the top half of its head falling back between its shoulders as the bottom swayed loosely side to side, weaving its neck like a serpent. It lasted a second, but it felt like forever. I heard rustling from Mum's room at the end of the hall, and footsteps, loud, heavy, and disappearing in the distance. Screaming, cursing, as the intruder vaulted himself out of our house and my mum came skidding into the hallway. She flipped on the light, and I watched the beast from the closet vanish in a blink. It was there, then it wasn't. My mother, bless her, sounded crazy on the phone with the police. She never saw it, but she heard it, and she tried so hard to explain the sound while being completely incapable of explaining it. I had nothing to add because, honestly, who would believe me? Yet I couldn't stop smiling when they questioned me about what I'd seen, what I had heard. I'm 27 now, living on my own hours from home, and I'm getting ready to move further away. I've earned my degree, earned my career, and sleep alone in my bed after I drag myself home from a long day of work. Every night, when the lights go off, I glance at my closet and watch as slender, emaciated fingers gingerly push open my closet door, and the rasping, gross sound of strained breathing fills the silence of my room. A death rattle that never ends, soothing now after years of listening to it. I tell it about my day. I ask in vain how it is, and it continues to grow bolder with the passage of time. It leaves occasionally, sits on the edge of my bed, waits at my bedroom door, peeking into the hallway and heaving in stress. I hear it slithering down the hall, flopping down the stairs, panting across the window, dragging its claws across the carpet. I really don't mind. I think it knows that now, understanding in the best way something so far removed from humanity can. In fact, it's comforting to know it's there. Being a woman on my own, I just can't imagine life without it. I don't know how anyone else gets by without waking up to the sight of that face, the smell of its rotten breath. Some people can't fall asleep without reading, or white noise, or alcohol, or pills. And I can't sleep if I don't see those crystal eyes.